All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It is nice to see some new friends on the call. We are here for our August Big Valley Groundwater Sustainability Plan Advisory Committee meeting. So we are going to go ahead and get started with roll call. I'm going to start us off with roll call, but I would like it to be known, just so we can make record of it, Pat Scully with Scully Packing Company, he will not be able to join us today, so he is not present. So with that, do we have Brenna Sullivan with the Lake County Farm Bureau?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Hi, Brenna. David Wise, Bella Vista Farming Company.
Yes, here.
Hi, David. Peter Windrum with the Chi Council for the Clear Lake Hitch.
Here.
Awesome. Hi, Peter. Sarah
Hi.
Ryan with Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians.
Here.
Hi,
Morning.
Sarah. Good morning. Scott Hornig with Lake County Special Districts.
I am here.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Val Nixon with the Lake County Land Trust.
I'm here.
Hi, Val.
Hi.
Sky Hoyt, the domestic well owner.
I'm here.
Hi, Sky. Thank you for joining. And then Marina Della Janis, Lake County Watershed Protection District. So moving forward to review and approve July 23, 2021 minutes. The GSPAC should have had these minutes prior to review. Are there any questions or comments for from our July 23rd, 2021 GSPAC meeting summary?
And Marina, I also want to let everybody know that those are posted on the website as well, if anybody wanted to open them and review them and see what's gone on. And those are for all of our past meetings that those exist.
Thank you. And then we will add those minutes, those summaries in the chat for folks to look up here in a moment. All right, so can I get a motion to approve the July 23, 2021 meeting summary?
Motion approved by Kyle.
Thank you, Kyle. Can I get a second?
This is Brenna. I'll second.
Thank you, Brenna. And I did notice, Kyle, I apologize. I missed you on our roll call. Kyle Rooms is here. Thank you for joining, Kyle. All right, so let's go ahead and just go to our item 3.1, Big Valley Groundwater Updates, brief report of current groundwater conditions and drought-related information. So as folks remember, I went before the board at the end of July with Scott Hornig, some other folks from the Drought Task Force. The Drought Task Force is a non-board appointed committee. We're just interested users. A few of the folks on this call are, participate in those bi-weekly meetings. If you have any questions about the Drought Task Force, again, non-board appointed, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to get you the meeting invites for those. So we have gone before the board twice now. The most recent update was going before the board a few weeks ago, and we brought them a draft letter that was created by the Drought Task Force, just recommending that the board enact conservation measures following the governor's most recent order. So having folks do a voluntarily water use reduction of 15%. The board was in support of that draft letter, and they did ask the task force to come back to them in a few weeks ASAP with a formal proposal. So that is what the Drought Task Force is going to be currently working on. Again, I encourage all folks to be participating in those calls. I believe our next discussion for the Drought Task Force, apologies, let me just pull this up. It is on September 2nd. That is a Thursday, and that is 11 to 12. So if you want to be involved in that conversation, please feel free to email me and I can send you the invite for that. So that is the most recent thing that I have. Of course, the lake is getting low, looking at ramp extensions, and we are still getting multiple calls of dry wells, some informal calls, some folks calling, whether it be OES, environmental health, or us. They don't feel comfortable doing a formal report on wells going dry. So I'm in close communications with environmental health, OES, et cetera, trying to provide them proper resources. Sarah, I don't have an updated number off the top of my head, but I will get that. I know some folks have been reporting to environmental health, so I just need to get the formal reports that were submitted to environmental health as well with the state. But the state, they do have their dry well tracking form that I can also send the link to, thanks Sarah, in the chat so folks can see that that's a statewide issue. And that's only if folks go to that form, submit the information themselves. So that's what I have. Any questions or comments on that? All right, seeing none, I'm going to pass it over for item 3.2, update on schedule for the Airborne Electromagnetic Survey, AEM. And I'm wondering if that's DWR or, thank you, Erin, for submitting that. Or if Eddie might have an update on that.
You know, I think as far as this is concerned, because we don't have any additional information other than what we passed along, Marina, initially, just to let people know that we are no longer a backup secondary for the AEM, but we actually are a primary and set to go for October. So we will be bringing more information and big flying things to Big Valley very soon, but just wanted you all to know that was a change in plans, that due to fire in one of the other areas that they've changed it to be a primary study area. So that'll be happening in October.
Thank you, Christy. And then I'm going to pass it over to you for 3.3, quick review of notifications, protocols, and procedures for meetings.
Sure. So just a couple of things that we wanted people to note as we go through, and what we do is post meeting, we document everything and kind of pull it together in a final report of each meeting. And one of the things that we realized is when we have the chat log, sometimes people will make comments in the chat log and we won't have context unless it's matched up against the actual recording. So if you think of it as you put anything in the chat, if you could just kindly put what you're referencing when you make a comment. So pertaining to Marina's discussion of whatever I want to submit this comment, that will be super helpful for us as we keep reports and that type of thing. And the second thing that I had was, we've been going through a very methodical process of letting people know about all of the meetings. All of the meetings that we have are public-facing meetings that the public can join in on. And so if there's any places that we can provide you with materials to post on your websites, in your public areas that we can post it, let us know, because things are posted in hard copy and they are posted in social media. We do push notifications in the interested parties list. We do things like that. They're also posted on water resources. But if you have any way for us to be able to further that reach, we'd certainly welcome it. So, and that goes to all GSPAC members as well as members of the public who have joined us today. So those are my two items. Do you have anything else, Marina?
No, I just wanted to highlight what Christy said. And if you need any of the agendas or whatnot printed out, feel free to contact us at Water Resources. We can print out agendas. If you want to post hard copies anywhere, just let us know and we can make sure we print those out for you to post wherever. So the more we get the word out, the better it is for us. So just encouraging that. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and move on up. Christy, you're up again for a communication engagement plan, CME overview.
All right. So Megan, if you wouldn't mind putting up the slides for that.
Yeah.
So back in May, we had an agenda item to talk about the communication and engagement plan. And because we were cooking through so many parts of the GSP at the time and trying to get things going with some of the technical committee meetings and that type of thing, we didn't have a chance to do it then. And so what I'm doing is I'm circling back to that, bringing it to you now to kind of let you know where we're at with it. But then also there's going to be a lot of action going on with it here in the next probably about 45 to 60 days. And so I wanted to let everybody know and I'm very hopeful that people will join in on the process. So with that, just to give a very brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to give you some items about what a CNE plan is, communication engagement plan is, if you might not know, what beneficial users are, and then to give a little lay of the land of what we've come up with so far in Lake County. So we'll start here with the who. And the reason why a communication engagement plan formally needs to be executed is because it's a requirement of SGMA. The language in SGMA is included here on the left-hand side. I'll let all of you read the water code because I won't do it any more justice than it already has. But just so that you know that that's the language that guides us in making sure that we've surveyed and looked at all types of beneficial users. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a very involved table that is DWR's representation of the types of different users, beneficial users and uses of groundwater that could be out there. And this is certainly not a complete list. It is a list that helps to kind of prompt different entities as they start to look in communities of who different beneficial users might be. And then also, not all of these would apply to every single location. And so this is a very broad list for the entire state. And again, it acts as guidance. And what we're trying to achieve is we're trying to say, in Lake County and specific to Big Valley, who are the beneficial users and what are the beneficial uses of groundwater that happen within Big Valley? And so taking a look at the next slide. And just in case anybody wonders, these slide decks of anything that's going to be presented in today's meeting will also be posted along with the agenda and the meeting recording if you need to go back. And there's not a test, so you don't have to take notes or anything. So looking at who in Lake County has been identified as stakeholders, and as I go through this list, which is in alphabetical order because it's really important to understand that no one entity in any location across the state, in any locality, has precedence over another. They are all equally balanced. Water is a shared resource. And so these are the identified stakeholders that we call them stakeholders, but they can be they can be groups, they can be individuals. And so these agricultural users, economic development, environmental users and uses, the human right to water, the general public and community members, which pretty much comprise all of the different beneficial users, but then also can be people who don't have a specific use for it or a specific genre that's called out for stakeholders. Also land use, private users, and of course tribes. And in Big Valley, we don't have just the one tribe that's represented by Sarah Ryan who sits on it, but we have multiple, we have many. I believe it's 11 that we have identified that have ties to and interests in the Big Valley area. We've added some logos at the bottom there that you can see that are people who are entities that are represented on the actual GSPAC, on our advisory committee itself. They're comprised of the people who are here today. That also continues on to some of the other people that we surveyed and did some stakeholder assessments and interviews and questionnaires with early on in the process too. So lots of different people here. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about who we've identified as the beneficial users, what is the communication engagement plan? So let's take a look at the next slide here. And basically, a communication engagement plan, again, is a formal requirement of SGMA, but it should not be a static document. It should not be something that gets made and then gets filed away. It's something that should live on. It's something that should be continually questioned and revamped and updated throughout the process. I'm sure that probably as I scan the participants today, I think pretty much everybody has either joined us in a public meeting and understands that SGMA, we have a deadline of January 2022 to submit the groundwater sustainability plan, but that doesn't mean that any of this process for communication and engagement stops as of January. In fact, it actually goes on for a 20-year period under the communication and engagement parameters of SGMA and under the regulations of SGMA, but it will go on beyond that too. So it'll be in perpetuity that what we're doing is setting a foundation for it. So just the purpose of the communication engagement plan, meet those requirements again. Also, it's the right thing to do. That's one thing that I want to make very, very clear that from the very beginning of this process, the Lake County Water Resources folks and staff have been very keen on having everything be very public facing and very accessible to people. Also, it details the activities for engaging interested parties. It will talk about and detail what type of questionnaires did we put out? Who did we identify? How did we identify them? How do we go back to try to find other community members at different times? And then it also identifies what the strategy is for reaching out to those folks. So that would include things like detailing how we assembled and put our interested parties list together, how that was publicly noticed so that people could sign up for that easily, where that exists, what type of notifications we sent out via that. And then it also talks about how the feedback that we garner from people. During all of this process, we have public comment processes in every single one of our meetings. And then we also have an email address where people can submit at any time, any type of commentary, thoughts, feedback, assistance, offers for assistance. And that will all be compiled as part of this communication engagement plan too. And then it also talks about some of the forward thinking methods and tools that we might use. I've been very fortunate to be able to have the conversation with some people just recently who have really helped us kind of look at some other ideas and ways that we might be able to get the message out. I'm thinking in terms of talking with entities like Clean Water Action. I know Jennifer's joined us today because Ngudu is not going to be here today. But then also we had a public meeting last week on August 19th, where we invited members of the public to have a discussion about public engagement and how we might be able to get the word out. And there were some terrific ideas that came out of that then will be folded into the plan as well. So it's kind of in a nutshell what the communication and engagement plan is. So next slide. All right. So the steps in the communication engagement planning, I will let you read these bullet points that are set out. They seem a little formulaic, but one of the most important things, and these are identified through the organizational process of how you go through and what are the steps in communication engagement planning. But the most important thing I think on this particular slide that I want to call attention to is the little orange chasing arrows that you see at the very, very bottom. And I think that's really, really important because what that tells us is that this isn't a linear process. This is a process that, again, needs to be constantly reevaluated and to look at different things. So that might be things like you've identified local stakeholders, and we did that a year and a half ago, beginning a year and a half ago, but we need to continually be doing that. And over a 20-year process, we need to continually be doing that. And then also evaluation and assessment, that will change. So how we assess how well we're getting the word out now will change once we become more sophisticated in our ability to have lots of different avenues to be able to get the word out. So those little orange arrows are something we should always keep in mind when we think about this. So really quickly, I just wanted to give a survey so that people understood where we were at in this process and then also what's to come next, because there is something coming next that's kind of a big something and an important something. So we've already done the inventory of having the stakeholder assessments, which we did again, going back about a year and a half ago, we started those. There have been continual board updates that Marina has done in front of the board. I know the technical team has gone before to do presentations as well about what we're doing. And then also all of these meetings that we've done, and it's not just this particular monthly standing meeting, but it's also all of these subcommittee meetings or ad hoc meetings that are added as well. Those are all publicly noticed, and we've invited the public to be part of that, to give us feedback and engage in that. And then also those public meetings, like I said before. And then now that the GSP development process is a little further along, we formally started, I believe, in May. And so kind of stepping through everything, now we have the opportunity to really marry the communication engagement plan with that development process. So that will take analysis of things like we have been continually opening up sections of the GSP for people to review, look at, provide feedback, and to talk about. But then also at the end, when it's all compiled into one draft document, there will be a formal process by which it's released, and then we take formal public comment and formal comment from the GSPAC members as part of that process too. And so we're right in that little window. There's a check mark there, but we're just kind of coming down to the home stretch of doing that. And then what will happen is that we'll finalize that draft communication engagement plan. It'll probably be in the neighborhood of about 20 to 30 pages, and it will include all the elements that we've talked about already, and that will be released to everybody. I am targeting to have that done by mid-September and no later. And what we'll do is we'll post that publicly, and anybody can give comment on it. We absolutely would welcome people to say, well, in this certain area, I think we could engage this group, or we could reach out to this group, or use these resources, and kind of marry some of the resources that DWR has and some of the things that Lake County has already. and being able to kind of put those things together. And from that, public comment and input, putting together a final C&E plan and finalize it. But again, I'm going to say that we call it a final plan as a deliverable that goes to the Board of Supervisors to review as the Board of Directors of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, but that's not a final plan. It will be constantly retooled as we go along, but it gives us a great foundation. It gives us that starting point to be able to look at. So that's kind of where we are in the process. And I know that's the express version of what we're doing with the communication engagement plan, but okay. And on this last slide, I just want to go one more slide. Megan, if you'd be so kind, thank you. You'll see this email a lot, and I hope you commit it to memory. It's kind of an easy one to remember. If you forget what it is, it's on every single agenda we send out. It's on every single interested party list notice that we sent out. It's also in several different places on the website. And that's a place where you can submit to us any type of comment, thoughts, feedback, just contacts, people that you think, hey, did you talk to so-and-so about this? Anything that you might want to share with us as you think about it, 24 hours a day, that is open to us and we'll receive it. If you think to please put the initials, the acronym GSPAC, GSPAC on the subject line item, that's super helpful for us in just doing a quick sort of information that comes in, but it'll still get to us even if you don't remember that, so don't worry about it. But okay. In a nutshell. So I will just open it up to just see if anybody has any questions about this. All right. Well, I will also put my email up in the chat so that if anybody wants to contact me directly, I'm part of the facilitation team. I'm with Maritza Flores Marquez, and anything that you might want to say or ask a question about how the whole process works, then you can get in contact with us. So thank you. I believe we're sending it over to Megan.
Yeah, that is correct. Thank you, Christy. We're going to send it over to Megan regarding item 5, GSP section updates.
All right, everyone. I don't have quite a lot to say today. It's just a quick recap of the procedures and what we have available. So sections 1, 2.1, 2.2.2, and 2.2.3 are all posted on the county's website for public review. And the way that we're doing this, we're now going forward is we have a set date of when we need to get public review by on those sections. And so that date will always be posted on the website, and using that email address that Christy just mentioned, it's up on the screen right now, the water.resources at lakecounty.gov, lakecountyca.gov. Don't want to go to my home county of Lake County, Illinois. So please submit all of your feedback or questions that you have on the public draft. And as a reminder, this draft is something that you all have seen, made comments on, and we have responded to. And this is, and once we meet that deadline of that date, then the GSP sections will be taken down off the website for us to then compile in the final draft. So it's not the last time that you'll see this. It's not the last opportunity, but we are setting dates of when we need to receive that public comment back by. And that date will always be posted on the website. And we will be sending that with the updated versions in future sections that we send out to the GSPAC, along with that comment log. So I think that that's all that I have. Christy, is there anything that you'd like to add in, or is that a good summary? Okay, great. Thanks. So that's all the updates I have, except that there will be an upcoming section for you all to review soon, and that's section 2.2.1, hydrogeologic conceptual model. And so that is being worked on right now as we speak. And we'll be sending that out to you with a comment log here in the next few days. So be on the lookout for that piece.
Sarah, and I saw that you had your hand raised. Did you have a question for Megan?
Yes, actually I did, but then I didn't, but I do again. So in the, I just clicked on the link that Marina put on regarding the GSP draft chapters that are on the county's website right now. Do you have a place where you are putting the comments by the GSPAC members, or is there any are there any plans to kind of show the result of the how comments were responded to for the public?
I'm going to turn that over to Christy.
Yeah, so we have done this traditionally because of Brown Act. We've done it where we've sent out the document and then it goes into a comment log where we receive one-on-one back to us. And then each of those are addressed, and that has been shared with the GSPAC members of how each of their concerns was addressed. And that becomes part of the record overall of how the process has gone on. So we have not posted that publicly to date. That could be a decision that the GSPAC membership would like to do. That is certainly, you know, public information. And so it goes as part of the record that each item and each comment has been adequately addressed. The other part of that is when we've talked about those sections, when we've come back to the next meeting after it's been reviewed, there's been a top line of what the kind of like collection or aggregated comments were. And then we've had discussion points on that. And all of those are captured in the meeting summary. So each of those things that were questioned or asked, or a comment that was made, those are captured in the meeting summary when we've discussed it after the fact. So there's kind of like a double layer of ways that we've done it. Did that answer your question enough, Sarah?
Yeah, thank you.
Jennifer, did you have a question? And welcome. It's nice to see your
Thank
name pop
you.
up.
Thanks. I'm sorry, just to follow up on Sarah's question. You're not making comment letters on the draft public?
No, so they're not comment letters. What we do is we've done and turned out draft sections to the GSPAC members to review as we go, just so that we can have the basic content, and it's that process. Those can be publicly, we can post those comment logs if they'd like to, but what happens is that's just a way to inventory what kind of comments each of the advisory committee members have had. And then we've addressed each one of those and they all see it. The advisory committee members have seen that. And then when we get to the process of where the full GSP is put out to the public, then there is the opportunity to have those very public facing comments, which will be public. They're public information, we can make them. They've been more of an administrative record. And for Brown Act reasons, we haven't shared those until those have been resolved, until those edits that they've asked have been resolved. So, but we can, if people decide that that's what they want to do.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the GSPAC members or the community regarding the GSP section review updates? All right, seeing none, I'm going to pass it back on over to our consultants for item 6, Hydrogeologic Conceptual Model HCM update.
There, that helps to unmute. My name's John McHugh. I'm with Ludwig and Scalagnini, and I'm going to give you an update. And there's so much here to convey. I will have to give you some of the high-level information, and you will have an opportunity later to actually read the section. So given that caveat, let's go to the next slide, please. So a hydrogeologic conceptual model is really a way to write down and show how you think the basin, the geology, the water, the conditions, where does water exist, how does it flow, and it's based on published reports. It heavily relies on geology. We also try to incorporate well and water information. It's used to set up the numerical model, and it's also used for monitoring, planning the monitoring. It is a way to communicate. It's a visual tool. And the most important thing is it's iterative, and it should always be improving. So I'm going to talk a bit about the section 8cm and the cross sections, but I'm also going to back up a little because the 8cm does include an understanding of the conditions, which is another section. Basically, the idea is you have a concept, a model, and then as you incorporate and collect information, you should update the model. And then that model should inform how you collect more information. So that's the iterative process. Next slide, please. So tectonics, the earth moves. There are a lot of faults, and the faults are relevant to this basin. So that little square there is the region around the basin. There are a lot of faults in California, and some are active and some are inactive. And the history definitely affects the geology and the geomorphology, the shape. So these are right lateral faults, like the San Andreas. So you look across the fault, things move to the right. And if you have a right step in a right lateral fault, which these two little blocks at the top are demonstrating, you have extension, or things open up and can sag or drop in that extension. And the two little blocks on the bottom are when you have a left step in a right lateral fault, and then you have compression. So the main part of the basin, especially to the north and the east, you have extension, but to the south and the west, you've got some compression. So next, click, please. Click, mouse click.
Not in presentation mode, so I don't think the animation's working. So
Oh, darn.
Let me get presentation mode. Give me a second.
Oh, okay. Well, I can carry on if it doesn't happen, but okay. So this is just a photo from above. One more click, please. Just to kind of, we've got a basin here, and that's because the extension, because of the right step and a right lateral fault. That's all. Next slide, please, or click. So now we're looking, this is a geologic map. We've got Clear Lake to the north. There are a lot of little colors here. Those represent different geologic formations or deposits. This is the surface geology, and the contours are the depth to the bottom of the basin. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but basically what you have here is sort of a trough or a depression in the middle, and the basin thins on all sides, the east, west, and the south. We've got on the far right, we've got some volcanics in purple, and we have some old Franciscan formation in the green on the left. And then in the middle, we've got the dark brown, that's the Kelsey Formation, and those are sandstones and other sedimentary deposits. And then towards the lake, we have the younger alluvium, which is a mix of lake deposits that are relatively fine-grained and don't produce or transmit much water, and some coarse-grained materials, sands and gravels, and it's all somewhat mixed to varying degrees. And then you'll see a couple little lines of brighter yellow. Those are the very young alluvial deposits along creeks. Next slide, please. So this is that same map. The colors are a little different, but basically we're looking with Clear Lake at the north, and these gray lines are cross sections. So our geologist, Tom Regan, created cross sections, 8 of them, and he looked at over 1,000 well logs, but only used a little over 100 to create these cross sections. So they go through A to A prime to the north, all the way to H to the H prime, which is somewhat northwest trending cross section on the east or right side. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to hit on or look at a few of them with you. So I'm going to look at the H to H prime on the right last, and then I'm going to look at a series of these east-west lines first, moving from the south or bottom of this map towards the north or towards the middle of the map. So please click. Thank you. I just drew a couple, keep clicking. These are just a way to show you which cross sections I'm going to present. So it's going to be E, D, C, and B, which are all roughly east-west, going towards the lake, and then one sort of north-south. It's a bit northwest. H prime last. Next slide, please. So there's a lot to look at here. I took the lower legend and just for this presentation, copied it and blew it up to the right. So you'll see that on each figure. I like to be able to see things. So this isn't the final figure, but I've just kind of, did this to help everyone understand. So usually at the margins of the basin and at depth, we've got bedrock. So these are older Jurassic, Cretaceous, metamorphic rocks, or we've got volcanics. So basically there are old Franciscan and other Jurassic rocks that were deposited. They've been metamorphosed. Then later came a series of volcanics. And then there's the faulting that created the basin, basically. And most recently, there are sedimentary deposits that are represented as the Kelsey Formation and the alluvium. So alluvium are things like sands and silts and clays, and in some cases gravels. So the color code here, so we've got the volcanics on the right, purple, the older Franciscan on the left in light blue. In the middle of the basin is a green, mainly green and orange, and a light yellow on the left. So green represents clay. Clay is low ability to transmit water or store water. You wouldn't want to put a well in it. And then the orange is kind of a mixed sand or clay deposit. And the light yellow on the left is more of a gravel, which is more transmissive. It allows more water to flow, and it's better to store water, and it's ideally where you would want to put wells. So this is this first cross section kind of to the south, and then we're going to just go to the next one. I know this is rather fast, but what we see is that we've got in the middle of the basin clays, some mixed clay, sand, silt deposits, and a bit of gravel on the left, and there's some faulting. And these vertical lines that are hard to see are actually the control points or the wells. And they're also, we're noting other cross sections cross this cross section. So there's a lot here, and I can't get into too much detail because I'll run long. So next, please. So this is DD prime. We're heading a little more towards the lake. We've got those volcanics on the right in pink. And then we have a fair amount of clay with a bit of gravel sort of on the left or west, with some mixed deposits above that. And then you'll see on the right, there's a thin gray line at an angle, and that's those are volcanics or ash that's within the Kelsey Formation. And that ash is not very thick, and its extent is not completely known. However, it is very permeable, has a high transmissivity, and wells that are completed in it sometimes have a lot of yield or are able to produce a lot of water. Next slide, please. So now we're moving towards the lake. These are all different scales. So keep that in mind. These are all vertically exaggerated. So to make things easier to see, they're not one-to-one. There's a lot of vertical exaggeration. So again, we basically have the older rocks on the left and the right, and the clays with some gravels and mixed deposits in the middle. So the clays were derived or originated from ancestral or lake deposits, basically Clear Lake, but back in time, and some more modern deposits. And then the silts, clays, and gravels are more recent alluvium. Next slide, please. So again, we've got different scales, but now we're getting closer to the lake. And it's fairly similar pattern. So this green cross-hatched at the bottom are the older lake deposits. And then the other green are more current or recent, younger deposits. And I just wanted to say something about all of these cross-sections. So these wells are only about a foot or so in diameter. And so they're not drawn to scale. You wouldn't even see them if they were. And we're really working with little pieces of information, if you think about it. We're going down vertically, collecting little bits of information. And there's a lot of extrapolation or interpolation. There's a lot of, we understand the general concepts of geology, but there's a lot of connecting the dots. There's a lot of interpretation. Next slide, please. This is just them stacked. Again, they're at different scales, okay? But I just put the one that's furthest to the south at the bottom. And as you go up on the page, you're heading north. And you get a bit of a sense of how the geology is somewhat consistent, but does change as you move towards the lake. And there are some faults you see at the first one at the bottom. So next slide, please. And this is the one that's basically slightly northwest, but it's sort of running north-south, northwest, southeast, on the relatively east side of the basin. So you've got the volcanics on the right, and then on the left, you're heading more north, and you've got a higher percent of gravel. Next slide. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly because I see my time's almost up. But we took specific capacity values from wells and converted those to transmissivities. So this is a map, we contoured it, those values. And in the light yellow here is the volcanic ash aquifer. It's relatively thin, around 8 feet thick, and highly transmissive. Next slide, please. We did look at the hydrology, the precipitation patterns, and we've graphed that. And I'm gonna stop there. I mean, I had a few more slides, but I don't want to run long. This information is all going to be available for you to review. And I want to respect your time and not overwhelm you. So I'm going to stop there. I just had a couple more slides to talk about groundwater flow and chemistry, but I don't think there's time really to get into that. And I don't want to run long.
And John, if anybody has any questions, we do have a couple of minutes set out that they could ask questions.
That's good.
What is departure?
Departure. Oh, so we've got the, you mean on this last slide here?
Yes, what's that mean?
Okay, yes, great question. So there's a Sacramento is the red line, so that's nearby, but it isn't really here. And then we've got precipitation in blue, the blue histogram, the blue bars. And then we've got cumulative departure from the mean. So the mean is the green horizontal line. And then as you move year to year, that depending on if it's wet or dry, is a cumulative deviation, which means departure, from that mean. So we know the mean from the entire record, and it's just a calculation for, well, you have a series of dry years, that black line will go down. And as you start to build up as you start to get wet years, that curve, the black line will go up. So the black line is going to be is really just how much it departs from the mean, and those are the blue ones are the annual precipitation locally.
John, we have 2 more questions. Sarah and then Brenna.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to know where the, in terms of the local precipitation levels, which weather stations are you using?
I'd have to look that up. Probably Kelseyville comes to mind, but I'd have to look that up. I don't know if it says it there.
Down here at the bottom, it says something from the USGS data release.
Oh, I can look. That's easy to look up. This is in the conditions report. Tell you what, I'll put it in the chat a little bit later.
Brenna, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Just a real quick question, just to summarize the general groundwater flow. I'm assuming that was generally northward. Did you find anything different than that, or any anomalies, or was that the general trend?
Can we advance the slide, please? Yes, you are correct. Another advance, please. Okay, so these are this is a map with water elevations, and then we've contoured. Those are the green lines, and basically the high values are towards the south and the low towards the north, and water flows from a high head or high energy to low. So it is basically going towards the lake. There are some curves to those lines, and it's hard. It basically looks like there isn't any strong evidence of anything controlling the water. Normally water flows from high elevation to low elevation, and it's basically what we're seeing. The big caveat, or the thing to consider, is that these values come from wells that are constructed at different depths, and there is variation in that geology. So it's quite natural to see some bends and curves in these lines. There's no strong evidence of a fault controlling the water based on these contours.
John, this is Eddie. Just one quick thing to add is, with the cross sections, that's another benefit of this sort of the forthcoming AEM work that's going to happen. It's going to help to sort of perhaps refine and then add to some of that geologic information. So it's another benefit of the AEM survey that's going to be conducted, I think, in October.
Right. Good point, Eddie. So those logs, those geologic logs represent very small portion of the basin, and the quality of the logs varies depending on the driller and if they had a geologist there. And so this is useful and important information, and we've used it to the full extent possible. But it's really good to have multiple lines of evidence and synthesize information, improve the HCM, and that's what the AEM survey will help us do, is to look at, it'll help us look at it at a different scale also.
Quick question, those lines seem to approximate also the slope of the surface of the ground. What correlation, but you're also saying that that's the groundwater is doing that also. Is there a correlation between depth of the water, I mean, the hydrology of it, I suppose, and the surface itself? In other words, is the groundwater higher there because the ground is higher there? In other words, the groundwater isn't deeper at the south end, is it, than from the surface? In other words, the distance between the surface and the level of the groundwater, is it higher at one on the south than it is on the north, or vice versa?
It's an interesting question. I don't think I can answer it right now. In general, water does sort of mimic the topography, but there are exceptions to that. If the aquifer is known to be confined, then you really have a difference between it can affect the pressure of that water at depth. And I did see in the literature that there is a confining layer towards the lake.
Yeah, I think that happens to be actually a kind of an important thing when it comes to public policy and how people think about the relationship between groundwater in Big Valley and Clear Lake. I think that's going to be addressed at some point. The essence of it being, is the implication is this groundwater is flowing into Clear Lake, and I think there's serious question about that. So whether in point of fact that's true. Anyhow.
Yeah, Peter, we were looking at some hydrographs yesterday, trying to sort of address some of the questions that had come up at one of the previous SMC meetings. And there's a couple of irrigation wells that are close to the lake where depth of water is less than 5 feet. So anyway, they do, and then there's wells nearby that are 15 feet. So again, it sort of depends on sort of geology and kind of factors into some of the confining conditions and where that well's screened.
Yeah, thank you. I think that
All right. Well, thank you, John, so much for that section. And Eddie, we're going to tee it up for you for agenda item number 7, for those who are following along, which is the Representative Monitoring Sites Network. Eddie, you got about 15 minutes.
Great. Megan, can you kind of pull those slides up? Am I doing it or is Megan doing it?
I'm doing it. Let me,
Okay.
I'm
No
over
worries.
their PowerPoint. Give me a second.
Sure.
The normally lag time of PowerPoint is exacerbated by the fact it's Friday.
Gives everybody a break.
I think everybody's had a really long week too. Really, really long, seems like.
Is this the right slide deck?
Can you go to the blue, go to slide 2?
Slide 2.
And Eddie, as she's queuing that up, if you want to just really quickly introduce yourself for people who may have joined us today who have not been with us before, and so they just know who you are.
Yeah, sure. Megan, slide 2, please. The blue slide there.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sorry. Now we're queued up. Eddie Teasdale. I'm the project manager for this particular project. I work for Ludorf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers. So we're, as folks are, I think, are aware, we've teamed up with Stantec to kind of pull together the GSP for you guys. So I think with that, I'm kind of ready to go. So I've got about 15 minutes. Like John, there's a lot of information to sort of cover. So I'm going to cover sort of the highlights. Just for folks that perhaps are not aware, we've formed some various ad hoc committees. And so we had met, I think, last Thursday with a specific ad hoc to focus in on water quality and subsidence. And then we had met last Tuesday with another ad hoc to discuss groundwater levels and change in storage. So this is some of the information that was kind of presented at those meetings. So Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So again, going quickly through this, some of this is a review, but essentially what we have to do as we sort of develop our GSPs, we're sort of focusing on what is sustainable and sustainable management. There's 6 metrics that we have to look at, and those 6 metrics are sort of detailed below in slide 3. We're having to evaluate 5 of the 6. So seawater intrusion is not a sustainable management criteria that we have to address in Big Valley for obvious reasons. We're far enough away from the ocean. And so as we start to talk about the representative monitoring network, we have to establish a representative monitoring network for water levels, reduction in storage, water quality, land subsidence, and depletion of surface water. So again, those are just some definitions that I wanted to touch on. So Megan, next slide, please. When we talk about sustainable management criteria, I think we all agree there are certain undesirable conditions. So if water levels drop, certain entities, stakeholders might be impacted, they can't pump. If water levels drop, there could be impacts to the environment. So those are sort of what we're referencing as undesirable conditions, and we'll come back and talk about those and actually defining those a little bit later on. But really today we're focusing on sort of the RMS network, which is going to be utilized to essentially establish sustainable management criteria, the 5 criteria I presented previously. And for each one of those indicators, we have to set MOs, measurable objectives, minimum thresholds, in some cases interim milestones, and then ultimately define an undesirable result. So the monitoring network, that the representative monitoring network that we're going to talk about, is essentially going to set an MO and an MT, be it a water level, it can be a groundwater concentration, it can be a subsidence level. Those are the reasoning of why we're having to develop the RMS network to set the MOs and the MTs. So think of it as the MO is where we want to be. That's the ideal state. The MT is what we want to avoid. And the MT is kind of what we're going to be judged on as DWR looks at our plans and sort of trying to assess if we are sustainable. So the MT is the undesirable. We don't want to go there. So next slide, please. I'm going to move my screen here. So these are just, again, I don't know, we all hate acronyms, but we seem to use them. So you'll hear me use sort of the acronym SMC, that's the Sustainable Management Criteria. So in this case, we're dealing with 5 of the 6 SMCs. And then for the MO and MT, the MO is the measurable objective. That's what I'm calling the desired state. And then the MT is what we want to avoid. So the MT is something we have to set. The MO is something we have to set a value, a numerical value we have to set and include that in the plan. And those values are going to be based off of, in most cases, monitoring wells or representative monitoring sites that we need to determine through this process. So Megan, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about monitoring networks. There's different types. Okay, so right now we know William Fox and his team, they monitor 40-something wells periodically, and that's what we're going to reference as the broader monitoring network. But now when we start talking about the representative monitoring network, that's going to be sort of a subset of the broader monitoring network, and we're actually going to establish MOs and MTs for that representative monitoring network. And you'll see as we start to have these discussions, it's very challenging to do this. So again, if we were to try to sort of utilize the broader network to set MOs and MTs, we'd probably be here till 2027. So essentially, we're going to utilize the broader monitoring network. That's going to continue, but then we're going to have a subset of that, and that's where we're going to establish our MOs and MTs. So next slide, please. And again, the representative monitoring network, it's a subset of the broader network. It needs to sort of provide a sufficient density of wells to sort of represent that general area within the basin, okay? And then typically, you know, we're probably going to be going out there collecting water levels once or probably twice a year. And then there'll also be some additional water quality samples collected if we decide to utilize the same RMS wells for water levels and water quality. I think that is it for that slide. Next slide, please, Megan. So folks always ask, you've got your broader network, there's 40-something wells, when we're starting to have discussions about how to develop the RMS wells, how many do we need, Eddie? That's always the question. So you can kind of see in the graphic here that I borrowed from another project for Tehama County. Thanks, Sarah, for pointing that out. Is that, there's essentially a sort of a process that you can look at, and this is all included in Chapter 3 of the GSP that we're working through now. So there's a monitoring network process that we've kind of detailed in there, so folks get a chance to digest that at some point. So anyway, there's different methodologies. So you can kind of see there's some references that are included, and then there's a suggested monitoring well density. It doesn't have to be monitoring wells, but the word monitoring is used to kind of keep track of the water levels or water quality. So Hopkins is sort of a common method that folks use. And essentially what they're suggesting is, if you've got a basin that's pumping more than 10,000 acre feet a year, and it's over 100 square miles, you're looking at about 1 monitoring well per 100 square miles. Okay. So we think that's probably a little too much. So what we've sort of proposed is we sort of divided up Big Valley into a grid, and we sort of developed an RMS network where we have about 1 well representing about 5 square miles. That doesn't have to be the case, but we feel like that's sort of more than reasonable compared to sort of what other basins that we've worked in are doing. And again, the details of that are included in chapter 3. There's a monitoring network section in there that goes through the sort of the calculations, the reasoning, the rationale, those kind of things. So I think next slide, please. Actually, let's skip this slide just to kind of keep things moving forward here. So monitoring network. So I mentioned previously, we have to develop this network for water quality, groundwater levels, change in storage, depletion of surface waters, and subsidence. So when we started going through this, was sort of a summary from last week. When we started looking at water quality, I think maybe from a previous slide, we're trying to identify wells that have a long historical record, ideally 10 years at a minimum. We understand the well completion construction information. We understand that the well is completed correctly. And also, ideally, we've got some historical information. In this case, it could be water quality data, water level data. So that's kind of what we're looking for as we start to look at some of this. So the next couple of slides are sort of our proposed network for water quality, which we're trying to align for it to be the same wells as we do the water level monitoring. That would be an ideal case. But again, you all can sort of give us some guidance and we can ultimately finalize that at a later date. But when it comes to water quality, we don't have a lot of recent or actually historical water quality information from our proposed network. Most of the monitoring, most of the water quality data we're seeing is from the production wells. So kind of keep that in mind, because again, we have to establish an MO and an MT for a specific water quality parameter. And we have to choose that parameter and then set the MOs and MTs for that specific parameter. So next slide, please. The next sort of representative monitoring network that we have to talk about is subsidence. So we know historically we haven't seen any subsidence related to groundwater extraction in this basin, but we have to monitor for that. So again, when we're starting to talk about our monitoring networks, we have to identify a monitoring network for subsidence. Next slide, please. So, folks always ask us, what causes, and there's lots of things that cause subsidence, but again, what we're looking at is there a direct correlation between groundwater extraction and subsidence? So water is removed from the well, that induces subsidence because you're taking that sort of the water that's sort of supporting the pores within that well or in the aquifer is being removed, so it loses the support network, and so things sort of settle. So there's a couple of images here just to kind of show you. In some places it's really a big deal. So the image on the left is sort of a video screen or capture from a well where subsidence has actually occurred. So the image on the left, there's two images. The image on the furthest left, that's what's happened as a result of subsidence in a well that originally looked like the image on the right. So it's just an example. And then the image in the middle, that's just an example of subsidence occurring along the aqueduct. And then the figure to the right is just another example of subsidence where at one point the sort of the top of that cement was land surface, but because the land surface is subsided, then we're seeing that issue. So it can cause issues to sort of infrastructure, roads, wells, those kind of things. Again, we're not seeing it, but we have to develop an SMC for it. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. So typically there's several ways to monitor subsidence. Some basins, counties have developed a sort of a GPS network where they go out to certain stations, benchmarks, and sort of measure the elevation, groundwater elevation, surface elevation periodically. There's no such network in Big Valley. And so there's some other sort of tools that are out there that can be utilized. So one of them is this informatic synthetic aperture radar. Essentially, it's a satellite. So this satellite flies sort of over a point, periodically, takes a measurement, calculates the elevation. That satellite flies back over at another point, takes the same elevation. You subtract the two, you can sort of see, is there any subsidence? So that's sort of the INSAR technology that's sort of going to probably become the future standard for how subsidence is monitored. So just wanted to kind of point that. So we do have a tool that's available. Next slide, please.
Eddie, just as a time check, you have a couple minutes left here.
Perfect. All right, I'm going as fast as I can here.
Mhm.
So let's
No
go to the
worries.
next. Let's go to the next slide. So essentially what we're going to propose to do is we'll utilize this INSAR data, and the INSAR data will be sort of, I mean, it gives you sort of a regional coverage, but we'll pick points next to our proposed monitoring network for, say, water quality and water levels. So ideally, we've got a water level measurement. We can get a subsidence point from the satellite so we can get a sense, are we seeing a trend between changes in water levels and changes in ground surface elevation? So that's sort of what we're proposing on subsidence. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the water level monitoring network. So again, this was a conversation a few of us had on Tuesday. And again, we recognize there's a lot of wells in Big Valley. So trying to come up with a sort of a process where we sort of select certain wells to represent an area that will be utilized to set our RMS, or will be identified as RMS wells, and then we'll set MOs and MTs for those specific wells. So the graph that the figure that you're seeing on your right, essentially sort of, there's a lot of information in there, but you can kind of see the outline of Big Valley. And then we've got the actual sections. Those are sort of in the lighter green. And then we've developed a grid structure. So that's sort of in the darker green. And so what we're trying to do is identify a well that has good historical information, good construction information. And then that well will become the RMS well for that particular area. That's the approach. We looked at, how many domestic wells, irrigation wells are in a specific area. So trying to sort of come up with a way to justify the use of a well. It's not easy, but we're kind of working through that process. So again, that's sort of how we're going about establishing the RMS monitoring network. Megan, if you go to the next slide, please. And so this is a sort of a screen capture from a document I believe most of you all probably saw yesterday. And so essentially what it does is it sort of provides more of a justification of why we're selecting the wells we did. So I think, at some point we'll probably have to pick that conversation up. It's not a big deal to modify the number of wells, the location of the wells, but remember, we have to set an MO and an MT for each one of those wells. So again, that document sort of provides the rationale and the reasoning that we selected the wells we did. They're not set in stone. We can adjust them. We can add to them, but I wanted to kind of point that out. I think next slide, please. How am I doing on time, Christy?
You're getting close.
Okay, kick me under the table when I'm ready. So again, this is just probably a better image. So it kind of shows you sort of, again, the grid sort of we set up. And then within the grid, we've identified at least one well that we feel represents that area. And again, we've got construction information, water level information, and again, we can adjust those if need be. Next slide, please. And then the other the network we have to set up is a groundwater storage network. So again, that's another metro, an SMC we have to develop. And so in this case, groundwater storage changes occur. And the idea is if we can keep water levels stable, then in theory, change in storage should be stable. So this sort of bucket is sort of thought to explain that. So as an example, the stable storage image on the left, that's kind of what we're aiming to do. And so the thought is, could we utilize the groundwater level monitoring network to represent or be a proxy for storage change? So water levels don't change, storage is not changing. So again, that's sort of what we're proposing for the RMS network for groundwater storage. Next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. Again, that would be the same network that we're proposing for groundwater levels and groundwater storage, and perhaps ideally even groundwater quality. We can have those discussions at some point. Next slide, please. That's it. I'm done. So I didn't mean to rush it, but again, that information is going to be detailed in Chapter 3. I think my recommendation is at some point I would like to get this group to agree on an RMS network, and then that gets sort of taken to the board for their approval. And then again, we can incorporate that into the sort of final Chapter 3 monitoring network section, versus getting the section out and then there's some disagreement on which wells we're going to use. I think it's better if we can agree on that before we finalize that Chapter 3 monitoring network. So I think with that, I don't know if we have time for questions, Christy, or where do we want to go? So.
Sure. If any GSPAC members have any immediate questions, you're always welcome to ask questions as you think about it. And towards the end, we have some comment period at the end as well.
Christy, could I ask one quick question?
Sure.
So I guess what would this group think about if we essentially, because again, in some basins, this is the 3-month process, but we don't have 3 months. So what would folks think about if we kind of continue to develop chapter 3, we put into that chapter 3 what we're proposing for our various monitoring networks, then that gives folks a chance to kind of digest it, spend some time looking at it. That's one option. Or the second option is we could set up some additional ad hoc meetings to kind of get that process or get those wells identified sooner rather than later, and then incorporate it into the draft chapter. So I guess there's 2 options there. I don't know, but I need some feedback on that. Otherwise, I think we're just going to kind of keep plugging ahead and get a draft out to you all to review, and then that would give you some additional time and not feel like you're rushed to sort of agree on that process. But ultimately, we've all got to agree on the RMS wells and then the MOs and MTs, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So
Eddie, we have 2 raised hands. It was Brenna and then Sarah.
perfect. Yay. What's going on?
Hi, Eddie. So my personal opinion is that we go ahead and put your recommendations in the chapter 3 draft. The SMC group had a chance to review it, and I don't know if we have the luxury of time to kick it down a few meetings from now. I think that if people have time to read and digest it in the chapter and can provide their comments there, that would be my recommendation, is just to move forward. I think your reasoning and justifications for the wells you chose sounded reasonable to me, and people can dive into that more on their own time. I just think in the interest of time and moving this forward, that's what I would suggest.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, during the SMC meeting we had the other day, one of the comments I made was the creation of, or the sharing of, the information that was used to identify those wells as potential RMS wells. I really like the slide that you showed that had a table in it on the RMS monitoring network. It said East Central, and it made me think that you had created, go back maybe a slide or 2. Yeah, that one. So it makes me think that you've got a table like this for all the wells perhaps, and I think it would be, in the interest of transparency, it would be useful to see the evaluation, to see the information that's behind the evaluations, just so we could understand why you chose those wells and not other wells.
Sure.
So I know that when I mentioned it was only a couple days till today's meeting, but if that can be shared for all of the wells that were considered, then I think that would be helpful for not only the public, but for those of us on the committee to be able to, vet them a little more.
And my understanding that information has been shared, right? Megan, didn't an email or somebody sent some packet out last night, I think.
Yes, that was shared yesterday around 4:30 p.m.
So if folks didn't get that, let us know. But yeah, so we tried to get that information out.
Got another hand up. Peter, did you have a question?
Yes, following up on both those comments very quickly. Yes, I did see what you sent out, and then I did the same analysis on each of those wells, and they look like based on that, look like sound decisions for these wells. I would join with Brenna and say, let's go ahead and designate these. And there's none of these wells looks like they should be discarded at all. They all seem to meet good criteria, and that you're all really careful in selecting them. So I say we go ahead, and if there's something that pops up we don't know about, well, we can deal with that later.
Right. And we can change it. It's not like when we make once we go to the board, obviously that decision is locked in. But for this group, we're looking at this as a draft and getting feedback. So we can make changes if we need to. But okay, that's great. I appreciate it.
And Sarah, we're going back to Sarah, has her hand raised again.
Yeah, thank you. So it was sent out last night. I'm just asking for a little time to be able to review it before you finalize putting these in the documentation that's going to the board and moving forward with it.
Sure. Let us know how much time you need. And again, it doesn't really impact us in the next week or so, but eventually when this comes back to this group and then we take it to the board, which I don't know if it'll be in September or October, but yeah, you have a couple of weeks or a week or two to kind of chew on this a little bit.
Yeah, this is Sky. Can I comment now?
Absolutely, Sky, go ahead.
Okay, so, I don't have any objection with accepting those wells for sure, but I do want to say, and I want to repeat, I think what Peter said in that committee meeting the other day, that we probably should try to connect with well drillers and pump service people to evaluate this, because they deal with lots of wells. And I would throw into that also people, farm managers like David, who deals with many different pieces of property. It probably has much better experience to look at whether these are the right wells or proper wells. I mean, my experience certainly doesn't qualify me to evaluate that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, we can talk offline how to make that happen. It can be difficult sort of with the contractors because getting them in a room to talk about it, but we can have a conversation about it and try to address it, or at least utilize that as another metric. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eddie. And we are running a little long on some of these, but we are scheduled to go to agenda item number 8 next, which Ibrahim is going to be talking about the Groundwater Dependent Ecosystems Subcommittee. We've had one of those meetings. We're going to have another one coming up. Those are posted on the Lake County Water Resources website if you want to join us. Ibrahim?
Yes. Megan, do you have slides?
Ibrahim, did you put your slides in the master one that was on SharePoint?
Okay, no worries. You can just share one of the slides that's just show the Adobe Cake that's Eddie had. So we had last week, we had our first actually not SMC, it's an ad hoc committee on GDEs. And in that meeting, we went through the GDE requirement as outlined in the SGMA legislation. Basically, the SGMA define what a GDE is. It's a community, ecological community that relies in full or in part on groundwater. And then we also went through the process that's recommended by DWR and also by the Nature Conservancy, TNC, in collaboration with DWR for how to identify the GDEs. DWR and TNC and also Department of Fish and Wildlife recognized the challenge that's all the counties and communities in California face trying to identify the GDEs. So they decided to do the legwork for the communities. They pulled together about 20 different databases and built an initial data set that described GDEs or identified potential GDEs in all affected groundwater in the state. And then they recommend you start from this database of identified features, and on top of that, add local perspective and local information to verify whether these are true GDEs or there is additional GDEs. And there is an elaborate criteria you can go through in terms of verifying truly that these features don't basically receive, for example, receive surface water or rely 100% on surface water, and so forth. So we identified the area a number of GDE habitat or potential GDE's habitat. One cluster was of riparian cottonwood and other riparian habitat above Adobe Creek Reservoir, and one additional cluster downstream on Kelsey Creek around the groundwater recharge facility. And then also feedback from stakeholder and from Peter, who identified another cluster of habitat along McCall Creek, slough, sorry. And in the meeting, also some of the feedback we got is we might want to expand the definition of the GDEs and include all the habitat along the creeks. Those were identified in the database that TNC and DWR prepared as wetlands, but actually what we see, they're actually riparian habitat when we visited the creeks. And so the feedback we got from the GDE committee is at this point in time, since we don't have field data to look at the groundwater depth and shallow, specifically looking at shallow groundwater, and define and with high confidence say those 100% relying surface water are not on groundwater, might as well include all of those identified habitat as potential GDEs, and that's kind of direction we're going through. So our next GDE meeting is planned for September 2nd, and at that meeting we will be focusing our attention on the question of the fisheries on the creek, especially the hitch. And we have a presentation by Peter, and I think Sarah Ryan will also provide some perspective on the cultural and importance value of the hitch. And one thing to notice, I think, is kind of tying up into the discussion that just Eddie had. There is no specific measurable objectives or minimum threshold tied to GDEs, but they address through the depletion of interconnected surface waters. And that topic will be starting to talk about today. At 3 o'clock, we have an SMC that focused on the interconnected surface water. And once we kind of have a foundation understanding of what do we know and what we don't know about how surface and groundwater is connected in the basin, and then how we want to monitor for it. And then the question is how to set up those thresholds in place with the perspective of protecting all uses of surface water and protection against depletion from groundwater. Sorry, I didn't have any slides, but does anyone have any questions?
I have a question about the public input process on the GDEs.
Sure, Anna, go ahead.
I'm just wondering how that worked and when that occurred. Sorry if you already explained that. Like who was invited to provide input?
You mean the GSPAC or public?
I thought you said there was a database originally developed by DWR and then there was public input provided on that?
Yes, there was a database. Preparation for that database was done by the Nature Conservancy, and in collaboration with DWR and Department of Fish and Wildlife. I think TNC conducted some outreach on that database. I'm not sure how far extended is that, but it's the data set itself is public and hosted on Groundwater Hub Resources, I think. I can send you the link after the meeting if you're interested to look at it.
That would be great. Thank you.
And Anna, in case you didn't catch it, those GDE meetings that we have, the subcommittee meetings, are open to the public as well. And if you didn't catch the one that was just held recently, there will be a recording of it that will be posted on the Water Resources website that you can access. And then you're welcome to join us. And the link and all the information is also on Water Resources for our next one coming up on September 2nd.
Thank you very much.
All the information we just described about identifying the GDEs and all that is documented also in one of the sections that's available right now for public review on the county website.
Great, thank you.
We've kept the county very busy posting things on the website. All right. Well, Ibrahim, thank you for the GDE update. I don't see any more hands raised at this time. I'm going to take it on the honor system that everybody really will come back if I give you a couple-minute break, just to take a moment to stretch and get yourself ready for our next segment. We'll run right at about an hour at a clip for what we're going to cover in agenda item number 9. So let's say we'll convene back at 12:35. All right. I'd like to start to welcome everybody back. Eddie, are you back?
Eddie's here on mute, but he's here. I'm here.
Okay.
You want to get Megan to pull up the slides? And
Sure.
I don't know if we need to do a roll call to see who's here, or we just get going.
I think we can just get going. And
Okay.
Megan, are you there to pop up the slides?
Yes, and I'm gonna pull up Eddie's slides again, right?
Excellent. Yes, please. Thank you.
All right, give me a second here.
No worries.
Over 16 months into the pandemic, and I still feel like we're on the Brady Bunch whenever I see people's screens pop back on. I know next time we need to coordinate that. We need to set aside 10 minutes every GSPAC meeting and take each roll call.
Great.
All right, so for everybody who's back joining us, Eddie is going to be going through agenda item number 9, which is Sustainable Management Criteria Subcommittee meetings plural update. Again, everything he's going to be talking about and reviewing, if you wanted to see the SMC meetings that have already occurred or those upcoming, those are on the Water Resources website. Got about an hour that we're going to be going through this information, so we'll try to shave off a little time, and we absolutely will leave a little time for public comment at the end as well.
Great. Thanks, Christy. So yeah, Megan, if you could go to the next slide, please. So before we get into this, again, keep in mind, you know, we will have developed this a representative monitoring network for 5 of the 6 SMCs. And now the question is, once we've got the network set up, we need to sort of essentially evaluate and develop MOs and MTs. So essentially a value, it could be a water level, it could be a groundwater concentration or water concentration value for that specific RMS well. So I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly, and I'm going to start with water quality and subsidence, because they are, I think, probably the easier of the two to sort of at least when we're talking about SMCs and the MOs and the MTs. So as I mentioned previously, you know, other than the current production wells sort of in the basin, we don't have a great historical record of water quality. I think I mentioned this at the previous GSPAC. We were fortunate enough to get some support or assistance from DWR. So they have actually gone out and have recently conducted some water quality sampling. And the wells that I'm showing you, I think they're in the red, little red dots, are the wells that DWR has sampled for us. So some of that information is going to trickle in, and it's going to be a larger suite. You know, I think there's, I don't know, maybe 40 or 50 analytes we're having them sort of analyzed for. So we'll get some of that information, we'll review some of that information. But again, that's just a snapshot in time. What we really want is we want a historical record. We want to know how water quality has been changing, if it's been changing, similar to water levels when we start to pick our RMS wells. So next slide, please, Megan. So when we started looking through the existing water quality information, this is again summarized in chapter 2. There were really sort of 3 or 4 constituents that kind of came out that we thought, well, perhaps we could utilize those to set MOs and MTs. And again, when we're doing this, you know, we're not trying to duplicate other programs. So other programs like the Regional Water Quality Control Board, DDW, you know, they are keeping track of constituents for their specific programs. We're trying to identify constituents that kind of give us an overall indication of the water quality in the basin. And then also if there are issues that are related to how the basin is being managed primarily through groundwater usage, that we have some control and ability to adapt and address those issues. So just kind of keep that in mind as we kind of move through this. So anyway, we kind of, I'm going to talk about 4 constituents that we thought, well, perhaps there's a way that we could set MOs and MTs, but keeping in mind that, you know, we don't have this historical record for all the constituents in all of the wells. So again, it's sort of a work in progress. So anyway, arsenic was one we looked at. You can see that sort of the water quality concentration limit. This is sort of set by the state is 0.01 milligrams per liter. And then the next table over, or the next column over, is the range of concentrations that we've seen arsenic in wells from 1944 through 2020. So you can see in some cases, there were a few wells that had arsenic concentrations above the MCL, but generally not a lot of those. So that was sort of one constituent we looked at. Can you go to the next slide, please, Megan? And so this was the arsenic data. So again, you can kind of see the image in the center identifies the wells, and then these are primarily production wells. And you can kind of see the graphs on either side represent how ground arsenic concentrations change through time at those specific wells. And then the sort of the x-axis is time. So again, 1950 through 2025. And then the y-axis is the arsenic concentration. So if arsenic concentrations in these two production wells was above 10 micrograms per liter, that would be above the sort of drinking water standards, and there would have to be an action put in place. The well would have to be treated or something like that. So again, arsenic is there, but we're not seeing it at high levels. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. Next slide, please. So another one we look. What happened? You're gonna have to, yeah, can you go back to, it should be boron.
Sorry, is this the right one?
No, go to boron.
Oh, okay, one second.
There you go. So boron, we you can see what the concentrations are, either 1 or 5, depending on if it's a federal or a state, or actually a USDA standard. We did find concentrations of boron, but mostly they were below at least the USDA recommended, essentially for livestock and poultry. So we couldn't find any historical, like long-term average boron data in any of our wells that we were able to track down through our various public sources. Next slide, please. Nitrate was another one. And again, there's a sort of a state standard for nitrate of 10 milligrams per liter. And we did find ranges in the basin that range from essentially, below the MCL to quite a bit above the MCL. And I think the next slide, please, Megan, kind of shows you 2 wells. Again, it's the same production wells because they're required to sample for that. This is looking at nitrate concentrations, I think going back to about 2005. And I think in some cases we didn't have anything. Well, yeah, one of them we had through 2020, which makes sense. So again, nitrate concentrations, yes, they're nitrate in the water, but we're not seeing them above the state MCL. And we don't see these, we're not seeing the concentrations change. So again, when we're thinking about this, establishing MOs and MTs for a specific constituent, we've got to think about that and what data sets we want to utilize. So again, that was just nitrate, a snapshot on nitrate. Sarah, I'm gonna keep going through TDS, and then we can maybe ask you, you can address your question, just to keep things going. So another one that's quite common is total dissolved solids. So that kind of gives you a general indication of the overall water quality of a specific aquifer or an aquifer system or an area within the basin. And so there's some general standards for TDS the state utilizes. It's 500 milligrams per liter and 1,000 milligrams per liter. And then again, we looked at the range of concentrations, and they sort of range from, well below the secondary MCL to a little bit above the secondary MCL. So again, if you go to the next slide, Megan, please. We had a couple of additional wells, and you can kind of see the map sort of illustrates the well locations. And then we've got I call them chemographs, kind of like a hydrograph, but it's for chemistry. So you can kind of see concentrations of TDS in one well, were at one point sort of close to 500, but now as of, 1980, it's old, or below 200. And then I think if you go to the right, you'll see there's some more recent data for TDS that's well below 200. And again, the areas that are sort of highlighted in red, or the dots on the map, that's, TDS is one of the parameters we're going to have DWR. Well, they've already sampled the well. So we'll get some more recent data to kind of see how has TDS changed in the basin. Unfortunately, we don't have TDS at that specific well historically, but it gives us a sense of how TDS has changed. If TDS concentrations come back above 800 from DWR's sort of recent sampling event, that kind of maybe might cause us to sort of readjust where we set the MOs and MTs for TDS if we decide to do that. So we go to the next slide, please. So an idea for water quality, again, we don't need to make a decision today, but we need to have some discussions about it, because ultimately this has got to be included in the plan. Is one idea could be, we know that the recommended secondary MCL by the state for TDS is 500. We could choose to set an MO. So the MO is the goal, could be set at 500. We could set the MT at 500 if folks decided. In other basins, in some cases, they set the MO at 500, and then the MT remember is the undesirable state or condition. We could set that at 750, 1,000. Again, this is something that we get to choose. So it's just an idea. So I think with that, next slide, please. I haven't forgotten about you, Sarah. I just want to kind of get through this section. So on the water quality, this is just an example of if we chose to utilize TDS, right? So you've got the TDS concentrations through time that you saw from the previous slide. And then essentially we have to propose an MO and an MT that we'll manage to. So if we chose TDS as an example, the MO would be 500. We're well below that today. And then the MT, we could be set at 1,000. We've sort of, just for illustrative purposes, we set it at 750. But again, that's kind of the approach. And then ideally every year we have to kind of update these figures, and we got to make sure that we're operating, ideally under the MO, but at the MO. And then if we start to approach the MT, then we have to make some local management decisions to try to figure out, okay, how do we fix that? How do we get the MT? How do we get below the MT? So again, that's just a concept that we wanted to kind of get out there and show you guys. And so we could utilize TDS, we could use nitrate, we could use arsenic, we could use boron, but from what little data we have, we're not seeing any issues with a historical record for nitrate, boron, and arsenic. So TDS seemed to be our best data set. Something else to keep in mind is, the county has to implement a sampling approach, and there's cost with collecting samples, not just the water levels, but also the water quality. So, TDS is relatively inexpensive to run. And so we could do it once or twice a year versus some of the other constituents might be a little more expensive. So again, something to think about. But again, this is a stakeholder driven process. And so we want some feedback, I think, at some point. Next slide, please. So this is a summary table, then I'll stop. Sarah, I'll come back to your question and we can move on to subsidence. So these are the decisions that we need to make that ultimately get included into the GSP for chapter 3. So in this case, the sustainability indicator is going to be degraded groundwater quality related to pumping. The measurement, one idea could be, we could use total dissolved solids, we could use nitrate, we could use arsenic, we could use sulfate, we could use boron, but anyway, we're just sort of proposing TDS. And then the minimum threshold, that's what we want to avoid. In this case, it could be set at 750 milligrams per liter. The measurable objective, in this case, as an example, it could be set at the MCL, which for the state of California is 500 milligrams per liter. So that could be the goal could be 500, the MT could be set at 750. And then interim milestones, it would really depend. Right now, we're so far below the MO, but if we were to hit the MT, the interim milestones would show up sort of a pathway on how we get from the MT back to the MO. So really, it's just the difference between the MO and the MT, and you divide that over the time it takes to get back down to the MO. So I know that's a lot. And then another question we need to address, and at some point, and we can put together some language and include that into the chapter, and you guys can provide comment, but what is considered an undesirable result? Again, that's a local decision. So in other basins, a typical or an example undesirable result could be at least 25% of the RMS wells, of our wells would exceed the MT for 2 consecutive years. So that could be considered an undesirable result. So the idea is once that happens, then there has to be a management or project that would get that MT back down below with the MT and ideally towards the MO. So I guess that's sort of the approach on sustainable management criteria and the MOs and the MTs, but really a lot of it relies on the RMS well network. So I think if you go to the next slide, Megan, I think I'm done with water quality. So Sarah, do you want to ask your question regarding water quality, or does anybody have questions on the water quality? Not necessarily the RMS network because we're working through that, but on utilizing what kind of analytes do we want to utilize for the sustainability indicators specific to degraded groundwater quality, but also the concepts of an MO and an MT, and also an undesirable result, because these are really important, and you know, we need some feedback on that. You know, either through written, verbal. So I guess with that, got a couple questions. Great. I have two screens, so I don't know who's asking.
Sarah, go ahead first, and then Brenna will have you up second.
Hi, Sarah.
You. Hey, so a few questions actually. Can you go back to the arsenic slide?
Sure. Megan can. I can't.
Or yeah. Okay, so unless there are unit of measure discrepancies here, I just want to point this out. For arsenic, it says 0.01 milligrams per liter is a water quality concentration limit, and the range of concentration has been to 0.05. So there has been exceedances with the with arsenic and also with nitrates, because you can see that the limit set by the I mean, I'm assuming the Safe Drinking Water Act,
right,
is 10, and the range of concentration goes up to 65.5. So if you move to the next slide, which I think is also the arsenic graphing, and it's a little hard to read, but it looks like the unit of measure on the arsenic concentration on the axis, is that in micrograms per liter or milligrams per liter? So, you know, it's a little confusing for the public. Like, I know this stuff because I work with it, but, you know, you should use the same unit of measure that the standards are in. And it does, you know, from the table on the previous page, it does look like there's been exceedances for arsenic and nitrates. And, you know, it's my other, so a question about being able to, if the data is accessible, to take a look at this. And also, you know, what's happening on Kelsey Creek with, you know, with those arsenic detections. Just wondering about that. But yeah, I think there's a unit of measure issue here, just from the way that you're describing it, that there haven't been any exceedances, but just even from looking at this, there have been for arsenic and nitrates. And then why would we choose? And arsenic and nitrate actually are primary contaminants in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I don't think TDS is, it might be a secondary, it might be a primary, but arsenic and nitrates have to do with health issues. TDS is, you know, kind of other considerations. So it seems that, you know, if we're talking about domestic wells and members of the public, you know, being confident that this groundwater sustainability plan is going to protect them from these undesirable effects, that they would not want to have it be okay for a certain percentage of wells to have arsenic or nitrates before it triggers other stuff. And I think it's important for people to know that, that, you know, that's kind of up for grabs here, like a certain percentage of wells, you know, to set that MT. For it to be a certain number of wells that could actually have these contaminants before anything gets triggered.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think part of the challenge we're having is, you know, I wouldn't feel comfortable setting an MO and an MT based on an MCL without having some kind of historical record, because let's say arsenic has been detected in several wells. A lot of the arsenic is naturally occurring arsenic. And so we have to be careful about if an MT for arsenic is exceeded, you know, the action can be, okay, GSP, fix the problem. But if the problem is really like an arsenic as an example, and it's naturally occurring, there's not much you can do, right? If it's man-made or it's something from a contaminated source, then I get it. So So there's some challenges there, but I agree. As far as the units, yeah, and that's our bad. And one is just milligrams per liter and one's micrograms per liter. So, you know, but yeah, that's the challenge with arsenic. So if folks are aware of wells that have historic averages or concentrations of arsenic, I mean, we would like that information, but I know we struggled to find anything that had any historical record. I think there were a couple of wells where we saw nitrate kind of spike up and then it dropped back down. So it kind of made us think that, well, maybe that's sort of a, you know, a lab error, but something we can definitely dive into. We have to dive into at some point. So.
Okay. Brenna, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a really quick question, kind of dovetailing onto Sarah's question. I might have missed was the data shared, kind of the metadata that was used to pull all of this information together? Could we see, you know, what wells and what years that we had these exceedances in nitrate and arsenic? And then I guess a process question, are you wanting to get recommendations on MOs and MTs from this group right now? Do we want to do it kind of after you go through your other presentations? Do we want to wait until we have more of that information? I'm kind of wanting to get more of a process. What's the expectation out of the group right now?
Sure. I mean, ideally, what we're looking for is a recommendation on a water quality parameter, a water level, and an MO and an MT. But I don't want folks to feel like they're rushed. If you need additional information, we're happy to provide the backup. But at some point, I would say in the next month, we need to get some agreement on this, because then we can take it to the board. So I don't think we're going to get agreement today, because there's some questions already, but we need to make some progress on it. So.
Thanks, Eddie. Just real quick, I mean, could you characterize or summarize on those exceedances? Were those outliers, or is that range kind of representative? Were there a few in that upper range? Was it just maybe one well, 1 year? Do you know enough to kind of summarize or characterize what those exceedances looked like in general?
Yeah, and we have all the backup, but my recommendation from the folks that did the analysis were they were kind of like one-offs, you know, random. But also keep in mind, we don't have a great historical record on that. So I think that's something we'll pull that information together and send it to you.
John,
But there's not a lot of information. That's the challenge. So.
John, did you want to jump in with a comment? And then, sorry, you still have your hand up, so we can come back to you for another question or comment in just a second. Oh, John, you're on mute.
I'm off mute. Statistically, data is not really relevant. You get like about 7 data points or more. So water quality data can change sample to sample and over time. And also metals, when you sample for metals, if water is turbid and not filtered and acidified, which happens, you can get false positives. So we may not have the metadata, the quality of how the samples were collected and preserved and sent to the labs. I'm not sure, but just kind of pointing out that a few records are their information, but there should be some doubt about the consistency and representation of that data.
Yeah, and I see a comment in the chat about all the wells, the public information. I mean, one of the challenges is, all we can get access to is public records. And so if somebody had their domestic well sampled when it initially was brought online, we'll never get those records. And again, the problem is the historical record. So if you put your well, installed your well in 1990 and took one water quality parameter, I wouldn't feel comfortable setting an MO and an MT based on one well that was sampled in 1990, So I think this most recent data set we're going to get from DWR is going to kind of give us a snapshot of kind of at least a current snapshot of what water quality looks like. But again, it's one point in time. So,
Eddie, really quickly, just want to read that comment just for anybody who may not have access to the chat. It's just just a citizen comment. It seems that And it's always not just, it's always the citizen comments are sometimes the most boots on the ground good comments. It seems that there's a lot of data out there. Lots of well owners collect data. Is there any way we can reach out to request access to well tests? Was the question that we had from Miley Field. So I see another hand up. Anna, did you have a question?
Yes, I was just wondering if arsenic is naturally occurring in other GSPs for other areas where arsenic is naturally occurring, is that still used as it's not? So
why would you set something when it's like you have no control over it, right? So that you can't set it. So
okay, but isn't it still worth it to be monitoring that even if it's naturally occurring?
Yep, you could, and that would be part of the broader monitoring network, but we wouldn't want to include that into the RMS network, right?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah, you have your hand up. Did you have a question, comment?
No, I'll lower my hand at this time. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
Christy, I can't raise my hand right now at the moment while sharing screens, but I just wanted to provide a little context on the units piece, because I think I initially created this table and then Jeevan followed up and added a little bit more context to it. The reason why there's a differentiation in the units, which I get can be confusing, is because we wanted everything to be in the same, at least up here in the initial table, for everything to be the same. So arsenic in particular is normally those like micrograms per liter and not the milligrams per liter. And that's why it looks like a small number here. But we wanted everything in this table to be the same rather than having to flip between units of measure and think that like to have arsenic look like, you know, it's at the same level and the same number wise as something like boron or nitrate. So that's the reason why behind we had the difference in the units of measure, but I do see why it can get confusing. Just wanted to throw in that explanation there.
Sarah?
Yeah, you know, I'm used to looking at lab results quite a bit, and my point was not, you know, but my point was that the water quality concentration limit column, those units of measure are in micrograms per liter. You look at the range of concentration from 1944 to 2020 column, and it's showing in the end range of 0.05, assuming micrograms per liter, which is an exceedance of the water quality concentration limit. So it's not so much that it looks confusing or something in terms of that, it's that a statement was made that there weren't any exceedances, and I'm just saying there, based on this data, there are exceedances. Right. And then when you look at, so I'm just, you know, and then assuming that the range of concentration column is in milligrams per liter, like I would just add that, you know, just for lack of confusion. But also the graph seemed to be in micrograms per liter, and I don't understand why. I think that's what, yeah. So, and that makes it look like these teeny little blips down there. But you know, if the standard is actually in milligrams per liter, then that's going to look like a huge, you know. So I just think it's one of those ways to show data that is just can be a little bit like interesting. Right. So just be consistent about it.
I agree. And then also on that higher arsenic concentration, I think that was from like 1982, and back in the 80s, arsenic, the MCL was, I think, 50 micrograms per liter. So it's changing a little bit, but I understand the confusion, especially when we're trying to present this to the public. So we'll fix it. So.
Well, and I think it's a key point too, that anytime that there is any kind of disparity between them, that we call it out, that we have a note specific to that to let people know the difference. Okay. Peter, did you have a question or comment?
A quick question. Do the domestic wells that are run by the county pumping water for all of Kelseyville, and it's right next to Kelsey Creek there near the town, do they test for these elements in the drinking water? I would assume that they do, and do so on a regular basis. Okay, then my follow-up question is, for purposes of ascertaining, I assume that those wells are not within this group of wells that are the basis for that we're working with. But does it make sense in this case to somehow incorporate those wells, since they are monitored and have been monitored and would be the source of probably the best information you could possibly get.
We're thinking about including them. Yeah, we are thinking about including them. So
Yeah, we're proposing one of the production wells for the water quality RMS.
It's okay. I think that would be really important, because I certainly could have to think that those they are tested all the time, and that would be a reliable source of information. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much.
Eddie, I also want to read really quickly a comment that's in the chat for anyone who doesn't have access to it of arsenic. This is from Jennifer Clary, who's joined us from Clean Water Action. Arsenic is a good constituent to monitor if the GSA, that's the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, is planning to initiate any new recharge projects. Changing groundwater chemistry can mobilize constituents like arsenic and result in concentration spikes.
Right. I agree for the larger network, but I wouldn't for the RMS well network. I mean, we can, but we're just not seeing any concentrations above it. But I mean, for a recharge project, that would be part of the feasibility study to kind of map out a monitoring network, which would include not only arsenic, but probably a host of other constituents. So that'd be part of the project development, I think, is how we look at it. But we can. I mean, it's an additional cost. And if folks feel comfortable setting an MO based on the data we have, then we can do that. So yeah, it's not a big deal.
So Peter, before I get to your question, Eddie, just for the sake of time to let you know, we've got about 10-15 more minutes before we need to move to just public comments. And if you run a little bit long, we can maybe go over just a little bit with public comments. We certainly want them. So
yeah, I think I'm about halfway through, so I don't know how far we'll get, but why don't we just keep
sure.
Get through subsidence.
Peter, did you have a quick question before we?
Yes, one very quick question.
Sure.
I noticed that in the case of the TMDS, that the maximum limit by, I believe this for drinking water is 1,000. And the question, should that be the number rather than 750, be the number for used for the I'm sorry, this terminology I keep following up that, but
the MT, yeah. So you're saying instead of setting the MT at 750, set it at 1,000. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's some entities have chosen that. I mean, my thought is the water quality is pretty good in Big Valley. So why would wait till it reaches 1,000, which I don't think it ever will. That's why I was trying to be a little more, maybe aggressive. But yeah, I mean, again, that's a local decision, and we'll probably put in. Our recommendation would maybe be 750 if we choose TDS, and then if folks feel strongly about it, we can adjust it.
Okay. Well, I was curious about that rationale, since the 1,000 was the limit. That's fine. That gives you a heads up if you're getting into trouble, I suppose. Okay. Thank you.
Sarah, did you have another question?
Well, just the point that, I want to make a plug for using something, in addition to TDS, because at least based on the data here, it does look like there are nitrates and arsenic exceedances. I know Eddie, you were saying that that these arsenic levels are. It sounds like you were saying that they are completely naturally occurring, and there's no, there's really nothing that can be done about that. I understand. You don't want to set a standard on something when there's nothing you can do about it. But if it's actually rising over time, and I'd like to be able to look at the data just to see, but if it's rising over time and it could get worse due to the concentrations could go up due to over pumping in area or during drought or things like that, which I don't think we have enough data to really say, then we should be measuring things that are primary drinking water contaminants and not secondary drinking water contaminants, because this is about domestic wells as well as other uses.
Okay. Yeah, we can look at arsenic, nitrate. I'm not so concerned about boron, and put together some recommendations, and then we can sort of see what the GSPAC provides feedback on.
One other comment that we have in the chat really quickly, just maybe I'm repeating what Peter suggested. Aren't all public wells, special districts has a lot of them, required to collect data? Can those records be added to this database? It seems like looking at data from just 2 or 3 wells is weak. So do you want to address that of how we've pulled the data records that we have? And
yeah, so we actually went through all the public records we could get our hands on, and we've sort of compiled all the historical information. So if it's out there for in the public domain, we looked at it. And I think other than the production wells, there's not much information out there. But again, we can pull that together, sort of similar to perhaps that packet we sent out last night, so folks can kind of see all the data that we had access to, and if there's other information that we're missing, then we could look at that. So
great. And Scott Hornung, who sits on GSPAC, who's with Lake County Special Districts, just pointed out that 4 production wells in Kelseyville are located very close to one another.
mm-hmm.
Eddie, you got about 10-15 minutes to dive into this second part.
Okay,
here.
let's see where we end up here. So
all right.
So let's talk about subsidence. So I mentioned previously, we don't have a current sort of subsidence network. And so again, this is an SMC we have to address. And I mentioned the satellite imagery that's out there. So this is imagery that we've been told will be flown now every year. And so this image that I'm showing you here, at least on the left-hand side, that's sort of a snapshot of the subsidence that's been monitored from 2015 to 2020, and actually 15 to 19. And we're not really seeing any subsidence. There are some colors there, but that's within sort of the accuracy of the technology. So we're not seeing it, I guess is what I'm saying. So the thought was, if you go to the next slide, Megan, what we could do is we could look at the hydrographs from specific RMS wells, and then we can go into the satellite imagery and we can actually pick or select the pixel from the satellite imagery to get a sense of how that land surface is changing through time, and utilize that as sort of how we would set the MOs and MTs. And so the graph on the left, there's a lot of information on here, but essentially what we have is we've got elevation on the first y-axis, so on the left-hand side, and then that we've got the x-axis is sort of time. So the blue line is essentially how water levels change at that specific well that's identified on the map with the red circle. And then you'll also see a little green line, a green line that's on the graph, and the scale for the green line is the vertical displacement that we selected off of the satellite imagery. So you can kind of see, the vertical displacement has been like less than 0.05 feet over that 4 or 5 year period. So what you'll see in some areas, and there's a slide that was in a previous presentation that we've kind of gone through because it's just not enough time. You'll see in areas where there is subsidence that's triggered from groundwater extraction, you'll see water levels decrease, and then you'll also see subsidence increase, right? So groundwater levels will decrease, subsidence will increase. We don't see that correlation. So if you kind of look at the blue line, yes, water levels are bouncing up and down, but there's no correlation between how that water level fluctuates and subsidence. And again, given the vertical displacement scale, that's within the margin of error of actually the satellite imagery. So we're not seeing subsidence, but we have to set MOs and MTs for subsidence. Next slide, please. So I'm just kind of going through again, for our proposed, the original proposed RMS wells, water level monitoring network, I'm just looking at the pixels from the satellite imagery at that location to see if we see a trend. But keep in mind the vertical displacement. We're seeing less than, the error in this imagery software is about 0.05 feet. So we're not seeing it, very much. Actually, we're seeing subsidence, but it's not related to sort of groundwater extraction. So if you just kind of go through the next couple of slides, Megan is just sort of going through, looking at the hydrographs and then the subsidence. So here we're seeing a little, if you go back to the previous one, yeah, here we're seeing a little bit more, but it's not related. We're not seeing water levels change drastically because of that subsidence. So there's other things that can kind of trigger subsidence, but we're not seeing a correlation between water level changes and that are sort of inducing or being induced from sort of groundwater extraction and then subsidence. And really in this sort of geologic setting, that's not unheard of. This area is not known for seeing subsidence related to groundwater extraction as compared to some other areas in the San Joaquin Valley. So next slide, please. Keep going. Keep going. There you go. So again, for land subsidence, what we're looking at is that's the sustainability indicator. Then the measurement we're proposing, we would utilize INSAR data from DWR. And then we have to set MOs and MTs for those specific, for at those specific well locations. So we know the measurement error is about 0.1 foot, right? So we've sort of said, okay, over 20 years, we're never going to see any subsidence. We've never seen more than 0.1 foot a year, but we could sort of set the MO actually at the level of the accuracy of the satellite imagery. Essentially, we're saying we never want to see subsidence occur that's directly related to groundwater extraction. So that's something we kind of have to work through. Again, we'll provide some examples or some recommendations, and then in the chapter you all can sort of provide some feedback. Can we go to the next slide? How long do I have left, Christy?
You got about 5-10 minutes.
Okay. So this is another sort of sustainable management criteria. This is related to groundwater levels. And I'm going to kind of go through this very quickly. We can obviously come back and visit this at a later date. But again, the principles are the same. We're developing an RMS network. We're going to start looking at trying to figure out how we're going to set MOs and MTs. And this is a sort of an SMC that's a little easier to visualize because we do have a pretty good historical record of groundwater levels. And so when we start talking about MOs and MTs, remember the MO is where we want to be. That's the goal. The MT is what we want to avoid. So when we're talking about MTs, we need to have some justification in the GSP on what is an MT, minimum threshold. And so what's been done in most subbasins is they utilize the percentage of wells that could potentially be impacted if water levels drop below a certain level. So that's typically how MTs are defined or derived. And so this graphic that I'm showing you here on this slide is some terminology. So imagine we had 10 wells sort of in our area, and we've got a ground surface elevation. Groundwater surface elevation, which is sort of dictated or illustrated in brown, the top line. If that ground surface elevation dropped down to where we show the 20th percentile, the yellow highlighted line or dashed line, if that was to occur in that particular area, grid, polygon, whatever we decide, there's 2 wells that would be impacted. So that would be 20% of the wells within that grid, within that area would be impacted. So in some cases, that's how folks establish the MT. They say, okay, well, we'll set the MT at a level where X percentage of the domestic wells could be impacted, not necessarily domestic irrigation wells as well, could be impacted. So that's the concept. And then the other line at the bottom is the 50th percentile. So, we don't want to ever do that, but essentially the idea is if water levels dropped from where the brown line is, the GSE, down to the red highlighted line or dashed line, there's 50% of the wells. So 5 wells out of the 10 would be impacted. That could be decided to be an MT, and we've seen it in some subbasins. Next slide, please. So what we did, again, we've got our grid set up, and I'll try to leave some time. Christy, give me like 3 minutes, and I'll try to address some of these questions. What we tried to, are we already there?
No, you're okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so what we've tried to do, we've got our grid set up, which you can kind of see illustrated in the upper right-hand corner. And then we've got the grid names, which sort of represent the grids within an area. And then what we've identified is the depth to water in essentially spring 2015 was just the value we sort of selected for this analysis. And then what we've looked at is we looked at examples. We kind of go over, we've got evaluated wells. We're looking at domestic and agricultural wells. And then we go over to this chart. I know there's a lot of numbers, but essentially what we're showing you is if the depth to water, if you look at the East Central example, if the depth to water was to reach 25 feet below ground surface, right? So right now it's at 22.4 feet. If it was to reach 25 feet below ground surface, 5% of the domestic wells could be impacted. And we've done sort of a similar analysis. So that's just kind of fast forward. So if you said, if water levels dropped to 59 feet below ground surface at that location, 40% of the domestic wells could be impacted. So that's the idea. And that's part of the analysis. And we've done that, based on this grid approach. We've looked at all the domestic and agricultural wells we can get our hands on. And so we've run these statistics. So keep that in mind as we go to the next slide. And so let me just sort of show you an example here. So the image on the right shows you the grid, and you can see sort of the red circle that's sort of looking at the north grid that we're proposing. And so again, there's a lot of information on this graphic, but let me walk you through it. So we've got on the y-axis, we've got the groundwater elevation, which is, calculated based on surface elevation minus depth below ground surface. But what's easier to review or view is if you go to the second y-axis where it says depth feet below ground surface, that's how deep groundwater is below essentially ground surface. And then we've got the time on the x-axis. So let's look at all this information. And what we have is we've got observed water levels. You can kind of see those little black dots there. And we've got those going back in this case to 1965. And water levels are bouncing all over the place. We know seasonally they change in certain areas, 10, 15, 20 feet. So then you kind of move forward till about 1990, and then you'll see some of these black dots have little X's on them, blue X's. That's the spring groundwater elevation. So we like to use spring for a couple of reasons, but really we know that water levels sort of fluctuate yearly, but spring is sort of a good baseline when things sort of return back to normal if there's a decent recharge during the winter. And Sky, just for the record, we did extend this through 2021. So those dots do represent, at least the last dot represents a 2021 reading. And so what we've done is we sort of looked at the last 20 years worth of water level data at this particular well. We looked at the spring groundwater elevation, which, today it's probably around, let's say 15 feet below ground surface. So what we have to do with this information is set an MO, okay? So an MO could be set at a spring 2015 water level. An MO could be set at a 2021 water level. An MO could be set at some projection into the future. We don't know, but this is what we have to decide. So the MO is actually the easier of the two to set. Let's talk about the MT. So the MT, again, that's the undesirable condition. We want to avoid that. So now if you see kind of coming down below the water level information, you'll see a series of lines that are in different colors. Those colors represent, and I can't see it all on my screen, I apologize, the percentages of domestic wells that could be impacted if the water level fell to that specific rate. So as an example, if you look at the green line, and I think it's the 30%. So if the water levels dropped today and they ended up going down to 40 feet below ground surface, 30% up to, if our records are correct, and again, we're utilizing publicly resource records, our reference records, would be impacted. So 30% of the domestic wells would be impacted if water levels at this specific area dropped below 40 feet below ground surface. So typically, folks will say, well, we don't want to see any wells go dry. If that's the case, you've got to set your your MT at, in this example, could be maybe 30 feet below ground surface. And then the MO has to be set. And again, that's a local decision. But as an example, if you say, hey, Eddie, what would the MO be utilizing this data, assuming we used it? I would probably say an MO could be set at around 15 or 20 feet below ground surface. And then an MT, you could set it anywhere from 25 to 40 feet below ground surface. So essentially the next couple of slides, we're probably not going to have time to go through it. We can talk about how to move this conversation forward. Is we have to establish MOs and MTs for every single RMS well, in this case, specifically to water quality, at water levels. So I think with that, Christy, let's give folks some time for some questions, and then we can figure out internally, how do we continue this conversation? Or should we present this in our, our initial analysis in chapter 3 and then let folks provide comment? So anyway, I'll stop there and maybe open it up for questions.
Sure. And I just want to let everybody know that we will take public comments now, as we always do at the end of all of our meetings. Rather than putting strict time parameters, we'll just see how many people might have commentary to provide and just kind of call on people as they come. I know that we're going to run a few minutes over. We try always to end right on time, but this is an important part of our process. And I also will say that I put the email back up again in the chat box if you wanted to email us a public comment, or you're welcome to do as a couple of people have done here and put them in the actual chat box themselves. So with that, I'm going to go to Jennifer with our first question.
Sorry, I just needed you to go back. You suggested MOs and MPs at 40 and 60, and what?
No. Sorry, no, I didn't. If I did, I didn't mean to.
All right.
I said if I had to set an MO today, and again, this is my opinion, which doesn't mean as much as your guys' opinion. I would set an MO probably maybe in the either 15 or 20 feet below ground surface. That's where I would set it.
And that would be protective of domestic wells.
Yeah, and then yes, it would. Yes, but the MT, I'd probably set that a little deeper. So.
And I guess the question, so my comment just is, when you set these levels, you're using multiple sites to set those levels. And I would just say that the average domestic well depth varies in the different sections of the basin. So I would just want to be sure that we take that into consideration
We
when
do.
we're thinking about setting levels.
Yeah, we do. So the I know there's too many lines on here, but the dashed blue, green, orange, or sorry, not orange, brown and red, those are domestic wells within that grid. So, and as you mentioned, depending on what grid you're in, those levels will, those depths change. So we did look at that based on the two, we looked at, we included domestic wells into our analysis. The depth of domestic wells are in the analysis.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions, comments? Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that in setting the MT, and maybe Eddie could, if there's time, could just bring this up again, that in setting the MT, that is going to be a trigger for additional activities to potentially happen. But before the MT is reached, there's no triggers. This whole thing for that particular MT. And so this whole thing is about sustainable groundwater management. So if we set an MT for whatever level, that at 5%, at the 5th percentile or the 10th percentile, that is basically saying that it is okay and sustainable to have a certain number of wells going dry, or for the contaminant section, that there's a certain number of wells that will have contamination. And it's important to know that, because it might be your well that is the one that goes dry, and it's like, too bad, because it doesn't meet the threshold. So I think it's important for the public to realize that, and to think deeply on it, because we have a chance to set this as a community. And are we okay with undesirable effects happening to a small percentage of wells and still consider that to be sustainable?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and that's why I think it's important to let it's a stakeholder driven process, and so that's where we're looking for input, feedback, because those decisions have to be made soon, and we have to kind of live with those for a while. There could be some opportunities to adjust those at the 5-year update, but I'm not sure of that. So my recommendation is setting something that's going to be protective of all the stakeholders, and so and then also agreeing on the undesirable result. What is considered undesirable? Is it okay if 5% of the domestic wells could potentially go dry? Again, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed to, but this is the best tool we have, to sort of help understand that. It doesn't mean that water levels dropped to 40 feet below ground surface at this RMS well that all the domestic wells would go dry, but this is again just based on the historical information we could get on domestic well construction information. So I guess Christy.
Brenna has her hand up. Brenna?
Thank you. Yeah, and on that note, kind of at the last SMC meeting, we did talk about the life expectancy of wells. I'm just curious what the background decay rate, if you will, of wells that are reaching the end of their expectancy anyway, kind of along the lines of what are natural backgrounds of contaminants. And so whatever we set, we also need to take into account that there are, specific issues with wells, different depths, and that sort of thing.
Right, and that's analysis that we've done in other subbasins or basins, is where right now when we're doing these statistics, we're looking at all wells back to 1965. We know that some of these wells probably don't exist or have been destroyed and new wells have been put in, or maybe deeper wells. So that does skew the data a little bit. But it's, just given the time, this is sort of the best tool we have to sort of assess it. So, typically, a production well is sort of, depending on what it's made of, is going to sort of guarantee, the life expectancy is 20 to 40 years. Domestic well, if you've got domestic wells that are older than 30 years, then, you're probably on borrowed time. So, but that's part of the analysis, but I just don't think we're going to have time to kind of evaluate it, just given the window that we have to put this together. So I think the data sets we have are going to have to be utilized to sort of set the MOs and MTs. So.
Eddie, I'd like to just see if Sky wanted to chime in. I know that he's having issues with being able to raise his hand and for us to see it. Sky, did you have any comments, questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
You bet.
So Eddie, I think it was the SMC committee just a few days ago, that meeting, you started to talk about possible remediation measures that might go into play if we hit, and I don't remember the right acronym, but I would say the alarm for a problem in the system. And some of them I thought were like, wow, these are really big deals. And so what I thought about that a lot. And it seems to me that in most people's minds, the only response that they have in their mind to an emergency in the groundwater is to stop all agricultural pumping.
Right.
That's really the thing. So, and I have had discussions about things that could enhance groundwater recharge, but would take longer to go on to create an effect. So my point really about this is, when we're setting an alarm, are we thinking of this as something like a last minute, here we've got a crisis, we got to do something like that? Or is this an early indicator to realize that, no, we have to devote funding, we have to refocus our efforts, we have to manage the groundwater differently, and over how much time? And also, what time of year are these, are you calling these thresholds, are going to be established? Are these spring monitors, fall monitors, summer monitoring? I mean, I think the whole discussion has got to be linked to what the remediation is, or
right.
what's going to happen after the alarm sound.
Yep. So a lot of questions. I think as far as the MO and the MT, the spring, fall, we typically propose spring levels, but again, that's a decision that can be made, hopefully not in the not too distant future. As far as implementation of projects and or management actions, the idea is to kind of, if we're heading towards the MT, we need to make some decisions to get that water level back up, either through recharge projects and or pumping allocations. So one of the benefits of our groundwater flow model, which we haven't spoken a lot about, is that model is going to be utilized as a tool to say, okay, Big Valley, if we kind of continue with our operations today, what are water levels going to look like in 20 years? The model can sort of simulate that into the future. We can also incorporate land use changes. We can also include climate changes. So we can utilize the model as a tool to sort of understand how the conditions might change out into the future. But again, it's a tool, but ideally we want to be ahead of it. And again, as far as projects and management actions, those have to be included in the GSP. So as an example, if we start saying in this particular area, you want to have an MO at 10 feet below ground surface, you're going to have to implement projects and management actions to keep it at that level. So it's sort of a an iterative process, but it all starts with how we define the MOs and MTs. So.
Eddie, just so that we know that we have an end point for everybody to be respectful of their time, we're going to continue this conversation just for about another 7 minutes to take us to 1:40, which will only put us 10 minutes over.
Okay.
But I want to make sure, I want to point out two things that were included in the chat box. One from Jennifer Clary to follow up on Sarah's comment. This body should consider how it will mitigate impacts to domestic wells, particularly given that a high number of low-income households are in the basin. As we talked about before, the disadvantaged community is a very high percentage for this particular basin. And then also Val, who is one of our GSPAC members, said a repeated theme is the short time frame that we have. What happens if we don't meet the deadline? And that's something that I think is important for us to let everybody know on this call, kind of what happens. Eddie, do you want to give just kind of a general gist of what we're up against?
Sure. I mean, my understanding is that if we don't get our GSP submitted by January 2022, DWR is going to step in, and I don't know if they're going to take control of it, but they're going to be more involved, and I think the stakeholders are going to have less of a choice and input into the decision-making processes.
The intervention process would be from the State Water Board,
Sorry,
and
yeah.
And they work in tandem with DWR for things that are seen as deficient, and not submitting in a timely fashion would be seen as the first step in deficiency. And so the goal is to maintain this under local control, and to do that, getting something submitted that is a good foundation for the GSP is of paramount importance.
Right.
Sarah, you have the comment, and there is no one in the disadvantaged community seat on GSPAC, so no one's speaking for them. Interested people should reach out. I would like to amplify that in a very big way. We have a seat that is on our GSPAC that has been open since the beginning, of somebody to represent the disadvantaged or underrepresented user community. And if there is somebody who would like to step forward to be part of that process, and to be, or even to join us on a regular basis, and to let us know that you'll be joining us on a regular basis, we would absolutely welcome that. Definitely something we're looking for.
Okay, Christy, any other questions?
You don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, so I think essentially the next 5 or 6 slides really just go through our proposed RMS network that might change, and it just shows you the statistics. So you can see sort of the colored dash lines as Megan's kind of going through that. You can see those levels change, and they change because depending on the specific grid that we're in, impacts how the domestic wells are sort of screened. So I think really the packet that came out last night includes all the hydrographs, all of the wells. It's got a map of all the wells that we have historical records on. So I think at some point we need to kind of get some feedback on that. That might change which wells we use. It's not going to change the statistics on the well depths, but that's something we kind of need to work through. And then ultimately, I think if you go to the next slide, Megan, this is a similar slide, but this is kind of what we need to agree on, I would say sometime in September. So again, we all agree, I think, on the sustainability indicator, it's groundwater levels. The measurement is going to be, I propose spring, because I feel like that gives us a representation of sort of when conditions sort of are back to normal, or back to the previous year, or back to the, representative of recharge that happened in the winter. So that's kind of what I always recommend. And then the MTs and MOs, I think, again, those are going to be set based on the specific RMS well, similar to water levels. The interim milestones, kind of, it's a very similar concept to water quality. And then the undesirable result, again, that's a tricky one, but again, here's an example from another GSP that we were involved with, where their sort of recommendation was when 25% of the RMS wells drop below the MT for 2 consecutive measurements. So that's just an example of what the undesirable result would be defined as. And then you'd have to sort of obviously implement projects and management actions to get that MT back up above the previous MT value. So that's kind of what we're after. And it sounds like perhaps the direction is maybe give this group a week or so to kind of digest, at least on the water level side, some of that information we sent to you. We've got to kind of keep our nose to the grindstone and get a chapter pulled together that lays out this approach, and includes a monitoring network, includes the SMCs, and then maybe it makes sense to have a follow-up meeting with this group once folks have had a chance to digest all this. And again, ultimately, we want to go to the board with some completed tables like, hey, the GSPAC is recommending, this is the RMS network for water levels, here's the MO, here's the MT, here's the undesirable result, and then get the board to approve that. It just makes then that information gets included in the public draft, and then it goes out for the public. So there's not folks going back and forth after the public review goes out. That's essentially what we're looking to do.
Eddie, from a facilitation standpoint, could this be covered off as a line item in our existing SMC series, or are you proposing an additional either ad hoc or something to specifically focus on this?
Well, I think the challenge is, the SMC ad hoc is a subset of you all. And so what I've seen in some basins is like the SMC ad hoc would have, I don't know the right term because of the Brown Act, but would have a recommendation or would agree on an MO and MT, an undesirable result. And then they would take that recommendation to the GSPAC or the Groundwater Commission. Then they would approve it, or there'd be some discussion about it. And then that gets taken to the board. But I think the challenge is, we want to make sure everybody's opinion is included. And so I don't know if the SMC, the ad hoc recommendation would be enough. That's my challenge.
Yeah, it would definitely need to be part of this body that would make the formal recommendation that then would go before the board. So none of that would happen without it being at one of these regular meetings, but hammering out some of the details to make a proposition of it. It can either be done in draft form of offering something as a starting point, or in doing a meeting specific to that would again be a publicly noticed meeting. But
yeah, and of course I know the challenge is time. So it might be in September. We have to have 2 GSPAC meetings.
Okay.
One to focus in on this, and then one to sort of focus in on the day-to-day updates. That might be an option.
Why don't we maybe say that we will give everybody a few days, like maybe till midweek of next week, to look at the documents that got sent out, and then to make a decision as far as having 2 of them. And then we would publicly notice when that other GSPAC meeting would be, and it would be put in on the Water Resources site as an additional meeting, and we'd notify everybody of the date, the agenda, all of those kind of things, so people would know.
Right. I think it's a good idea. I think the other thing we need to get together is a similar packet for water quality. So that's something that we haven't done yet. So we would do something similar. I think it'll be a little easier effort because we don't have a lot of water quality data, but also trying to get some of this recent DWR data included would be really helpful. And so I don't know, William, maybe we can reach out to DWR and see where they're at with their preliminary analysis of that water quality. So we need to put together a water quality packet as well. So.
Okay, so the next thing the GSPAC members would see is just a reminder and notice that you have, just a few days to be able to look at the documentation that came out. And then the next thing that the public who's joining us might see is the actual statement of the public noticed extra GSPAC meeting. And then I will also encourage everyone to make sure that they go to the Stay Connected on the Lake County Water Resources website. There's a place for you to enter information to be part of the interested parties list. And anytime we have any meeting that's added or that's a regularly meeting, we'll give you reminders of that as well. So make sure you sign up and that your name is on that so that you're getting our regular notifications. But It will be publicly noticed on the website as well.
And there was one other thing I kind of wanted to address. I don't think I did a great job of addressing it, but somebody had mentioned reaching out to groundwater, to the drillers or other entities that are out there. So we've tried that a couple of times. Me personally, calling a driller I'm not going to get anywhere with them on sort of getting them to show me a map of where the wells are, what the water levels were. But what I've seen work, and we've done this in several basins, is we've through the outreach and through the Groundwater Commission, we've seen it where we've been able to connect with individuals who actually collect water levels on their wells, and we've been able to utilize that in the RMS network analysis. So we've seen it happen, and it was great that they were able to share that information, but it was never available in any public records. Yes, there was some level of trust because we had to sort of rely that information was correct, but it gives us an additional piece of information that we can utilize. But it was, that would never have happened if it wasn't sort of from outreach from some of the groundwater commissioners. In this case, it was in Tehama County. So if folks have any ideas or know of neighbors that might have some of that information, I don't think many will. It can be very valuable. But we'll never get it just because sort of we're working for the county, and it's more about sort of personal relationships. So.
All right. And with that, I will ask Marina to officially adjourn us all. Oh, you're on mute, Marina. You always know if Marina's on mute.
Yeah, because poor William can probably hear me on the other side. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We will see you next month at our September GSPAC meeting. Again, all that information can be found on the Water Resources page. With that being said, we'll be adjourning our meeting today at 1:44 p.m. Thank you all so much and have a great weekend.